So everything I do with photography tends to be very, very slow. So if I'm not photographing the inside of these instruments, my other big passion is astrophotography, photographing the stars at night. And that's a similar thing. You can spend hours, days, nights even, trying to get a single shot through, lots of repetition. And yeah, I think what I'm really doing there is just another variation on playing the cello.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Power of Music Thinking. My name is Christoph Zürn, and this is the podcast for people with a musical heart and a wicked job. We're looking for stories, insights and tools from the big world of music to inspire leaders and followers to listen, tune, play and perform in whatever field you're operating.
Today we touch base on the intersection between music and photography, and that in many different ways. My guest today is Charles Brooks, an exceptionable photographer and musician that for the last 20 years has been New Zealand's most successful orchestral cellist. Charles held principal positions in Australia, China, Chile and Brazil with concerts worldwide. He also gives us insights in the organization and culture of professional symphony orchestras and shares personal stories about the life of an orchestra musician that played with Lang Lang and for celebrities like Tony Blair and Arnold Schwarzenegger. While his music career took him around the globe at an early age, photography was always there. Charles refined his photographic craft of making musician portraits, astrophotographs and landscapes until National Geographic took notice in 2011. And in the pandemic, he prototyped and developed a spectacular new way of photographing the inside of a variety of musical instruments, literally opening up a new space and visual world that give insights in the craft of the most formidable luthiers and instrument makers. And these got picked up worldwide by magazines like The Telegraph, Classic FM, Domus, France Musique, Daily Mail, and just recently, Die Zeit in Germany. So, please find a selection of the photographs on the episode page of the Music Thinking website. They're really marvelous. So now, sit back, relax, and be prepared for a long episode on all things creative. Welcome, Charles. Welcome to the Power of Music Thinking.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Let's start with the first question. What was your first sonic experience or album or performance, live performance that had an impact on you?
It's a tough one. I have been sort of a musical kid since before I can remember. There are stories my mum has about me being a sort of 4-year-old in the car on family trips and everybody's singing and I'm telling them off because they're singing wrong. But, I don't particularly remember these. I started playing violin and piano when I was very little, but, I was into it, but I wasn't very good at it. And then when I was 11, something kind of quite transformative happened. We were driving somewhere, probably to school, and on the radio came the theme to the South Bank show, which is a jazz piece written by Andrew Lloyd Webber for his brother Julian Lloyd Webber, who is a magnificent cellist, probably a cellist that should have had maybe a greater career, but he was always in his brother's shadow a little bit. Anyway, I heard this and, it's this fantastic sort of variations on a theme by Paganini, which a lot of other composers have done, Rachmaninoff, all kinds of people. But my 11-year-old brain went, wow, if I could play that, I'd be more popular. And immediately, I said, Mum, look, I want to change from this scratchy violin thing and go and play the cello. And I was learning at a sort of Saturday morning music school place where that kind of thing was easy. So I switched over, and something about the instrument just immediately grabbed me. It was easy. I was able to progress on the cello much faster than I was in on any other instrument. I didn't have to be told to practice. I loved it. I would just go and play this thing for hours and hours. And of course, that became my career for 25 odd years. Went to university, played in a lot of orchestras, went all around the world until I was in my just about 41 when I finally sort of retired from cello and went into photography full time, which is where I am. So yeah, that piece completely changed me. I never actually played it in all that time.
That's interesting. And it's interesting. So it was more, let's say, the popularity or the fame that caught you. And also, by the way, talking about Paganini, that's more, I would more imagine a violin than a cello.
Absolutely. I mean, the original is for violin. It's a magnificent, virtuosic show-off piece. Every aspiring violinist tries to play that sometimes. Some of them succeed. And look, I mean, it's got to be one of the sort of catchiest tunes ever written. There's a reason that it keeps coming back and back in so many various sort of iterations. But as soon as I sort of started the cello and got into it, I very quickly started listening to all the other repertoire that was out there. And I got, I found albums of Jacqueline Dupre playing Brahms, which I'd be blasting through the house, stereos at ridiculous volumes all hours of the night. It just led me down this huge rabbit hole. And I think that piece got left behind a little bit. I still think maybe one day I'll go back and play it, but I find there's an interesting sort of bookend to this as well. So that was what started me on this journey. And then, towards the end of my cello career, I was returning back to New Zealand. I'd just finished, 3 years with the Sao Paulo Symphony, which was an amazing experience, both wonderful and deeply traumatic in certain ways. And I came back home, and a friend of mine realized that I'd arrived and said, look, there's this band playing, they've got a gig downtown. They need a violinist and a cellist. It's not a lot of pay. There's no rehearsal, but it's super easy stuff. Can you come and play with them? It's just 2 little songs. And I thought, oh yeah, fine. I'll do that. I didn't have anything on. And of course, I'd been away for 20 years at this point, and I didn't know the name of any of the bars downtown. So he sent me this sort of address and this name that I didn't recognize, and I packed up my cello and went along, and I'm driving along, and I realized there's this long line of about 1,000 people all wearing these metal T-shirts outside. And I'm like, who is this band? What's this bar? And then I realized that it wasn't a bar, it was the arena. And the band was a band called Disturbed, which for anyone that's into sort of, I guess they call themselves metal music, they're huge. They're sort of top 20 Billboard, or number 1 on the Billboard for metal for the last 10 albums over the last sort of 15 years or something. And what we were playing was a cover of the Simon and Garfunkel Sound of Silence, which is something that band covered and it was a massive, massive hit at that time. And I went in and realized, this is a very serious concert. It was a very slick production. They gave us sort of headpieces and explained to us, yes, there's going to be a click track. You need to go in there, wait until you hear 3, 2, 1, then sit down. Don't sit down early, otherwise the chair won't be there. It ran like clockwork. It was quite incredible. And I could hear synthesized strings through my headpiece that weren't coming through the main audio mix. And I just knew in the back of my mind that if we were to, stuff up, someone's over a button somewhere, waiting to switch to synthesized strings just in case we weren't any good. That didn't happen. But what what surprised me was this audience. It was about 14,000 people, and they were absolutely riveted. Every single one of them was just 100% focused on what was going on stage and nothing else. And I find it odd that I feel like maybe I reached more people with that strange little song that, I hadn't put any time into, compared to some of the, the wonderful great opera productions or Beethoven cycles that I've done. That one probably engaged more with the audience. So it's interesting that I had a very sort of traditional classical career in a certain sense, but it's bookended by these two pop songs.
Yeah, wow, fantastic. So it started with, let's say, Paganini, and it ended with metal, and then also even a cover of Simon and Garfunkel, Sound of Silence. Nota Bene Silence. That's very interesting. So,
and their cover of it is in no way silent whatsoever. It's like a sonic boom, but it's good. It's good.
So, thank you for the listener. Maybe good just to you explained a lot, but at the moment after you switched careers, you're a photographer, and
yes.
And that's your profession, and that's also how I came to know about you, because you make very special photographs. So maybe just introduce yourself from. What do you do for a living, and how does it work? And then we cycle back between the music and the rest.
So I'm a professional photographer now. This is something that had started during, maybe even a little bit before my music career. But I made the decision for various reasons to switch over when I came back to New Zealand in about 2016. And I started out photographing a bunch of different things, normally music related. So often musicians, classical musicians especially, because I could relate to them, doing their album covers, doing their promo shots. And then we got hit with COVID and lockdown and all of that. And, I couldn't photograph any musicians. They had all become unemployed, or they were trapped in, some country far away. Because, of course, New Zealand's very far from anywhere. And so I turned around, and looked, what's around me. And there were instruments, and there were repair shops, and luthiers that were sitting there not really doing much. At the same time, there was some new camera technology that had come out, some probe lenses. And so I thought, let's explore the inside of some of these instruments. Which is something that I'd always wanted to do. I had become so incredibly intimately familiar with the outside of my own cello, or various cellos. But I realized that in, 25 years of playing them, I'd seen inside it maybe twice, and only ever for a fraction of a second, and never intact. It was always when the entire lid is off and everything's open for repair. And I thought, I'd love to just see really what's going on in there and make an image of that. So I did that, not with my cello. There happened to be a very fine cello, a Lockie Hill cello from 1780. He was a wonderful English maker. And I used that as one of the very first ones that I photographed. And
how did you do this? How did you do this? Was it still the strings on, or was it everything detached? Did you just mentioned the lens? If you say photo, I would say every listener would now think, okay, it's like a camera. But can you describe what it is?
So this lens, it looks like a long kind of snorkel or a long stick. It's about 2 centimeters in diameter. And it extends about a foot out from the camera. And the idea is you can stick it in holes and see stuff. It's got a whole lot of sort of technical limitations to it. It's very dark. It's a little bit tricky to use, but it does let you get into places. And, I knew enough from playing my cello that I thought, well, if I can find an instrument that's maybe getting serviced, maybe getting something done to it, we can take out the end pin at the bottom of the cello. And maybe not just the actual stick itself, but the assembly that's holding it in. And then you've got an opening that's large enough to go into. And this particular cello, it had been in somebody's estate unplayed for maybe 60 years. And was in rough condition. It had its neck broken. It's still in the process of being restored, so it'll be for sale in about a year. They're being very careful with it because it's a very fine instrument. But they trusted me enough. They knew I knew my way around the instruments, and I've got these all enormously heavy lights and stuff that you have to balance precariously over it, make sure the instrument doesn't overheat, all this kind of stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
So we maybe we have to explain the listener. If you put a lot of heat, a lot of light, there is naturally a lot of heat. But this is an instrument from, you just mentioned 1780 or
1780. Yes, yeah, around about then.
You could burn or even ruin that instrument.
And the varnish is a key part of any instrument. If anyone looks into the history of the greatest cellos and violins, like Stradivarius, for example, you can see countless sort of academic articles on people trying to analyze the varnish. Did he have some secret ingredient in there? Was that the reason that those instruments sound the way they do? So varnish is really, really important. It's also incredibly soft. They're not using a particularly durable mix here. So it's only got to get, a sort of over 30 something degrees and you're at risk of it starting to bubble, which is a serious problem. If that happens, you've devalued the instrument immediately. So there was a lot to be careful with there.
A whole dangerous setup. So if you never would do this with a Stradivari, I would assume. But
I will do it with a Stradivarius. I have some instruments lined up, but we have other issues to work through. The lighting and keeping it cool is one of them. The other is that the instruments that I want to photograph at the moment are violins. And the problem with the violin, they have the same hole in the base, but it's only 6 millimeters in diameter. And the lenses available commercially are, even if I modify them, they're about 11 millimeters is the slimmest that I can get. And we don't exactly want to, drill or widen a hole in the bottom of a priceless, $10 million Strad. I don't think my insurance will cover that. And I ethically, I absolutely opposed to that. I don't want to photograph any instrument that requires any kind of modification or something that can't be undone. I'm working with a medical school here in Auckland to see if we can adapt certain lenses for that. That's coming along very slowly because, universities don't work that fast. I'd love it to be next week, but in all reality, it'll probably be next year. So that's the goal. I have this image of the inside of a cello. I have an awful lot of other instruments that I've been able to get into various ways. It's starting to get more difficult. The instruments that are missing from my list are missing for technical reasons that I have to overcome. But that's part of the excitement. That's part of the journey.
Right.
I'm now at the forefront of, sort of camera and lens technology, trying to do things that nobody else is doing.
Yeah.
And that's thrilling.
That's research. That's experimental. That's prototyping the way of doing this. And maybe we just could. I will put the link in the show notes that people can see all these nice pictures, and they are really incredible. Because what's I think so intriguing, it literally opens up a new room. So it's like, I think it's like an instrument, but hang on, if you light it and you get with the camera inside, it's like everything out of wood.
And I'm looking on one of the pictures where there also a little, let's say, a round stick in the middle of it to fix it, something that you would not see on the outside. And
yeah, and that's the sound post. That's almost the soul of the instrument. It's incredibly important because that's taking all those vibrations that have come from the strings down through the bridge, and it's transferring them to the back plate of the violin or cello. Any of those instruments have one of these. And that back plate is what is making most of the sound. Most of the vibrations come from that. And so, yeah, if I were to photograph it without that stick there, it would feel a little bit false because, I mean, professional instrumentalists, they'll spend months returning to luthiers again and again, and they'll be moving that thing a fraction of a millimeter in any direction and, asking for it to be a tiny bit tighter, a tiny bit looser just to get the exact sound that they want. And they're often never satisfied. But that's a very, very important part of the instrument that a lot of people, I think, don't even realize is there.
Yeah. I didn't realize. And is it glued or is it just
No.
stick? So, but I would say if this instrument moves in some way, so there is the chance you just talked about millimeters. This would ruin the sound of a very expensive instrument.
Absolutely. I mean, sound posts get replaced a lot. Because they can bend, they can warp. People might want it tighter. If you want it tighter, you need a longer post than the one you've got. So, someone has to go and carve a new one. But they don't use any glue with these because glue would dampen the vibrations that are going through the instrument. Right. So, it's important. And they are fitted with, an extraordinary precision. Normally, it almost looks like they're carved out of the same piece of wood because they fit so perfectly. But that's just down to the skill of the luthier involved. So it's really remarkable what these craftsmen, what these makers are doing. I believe that in terms of woodworking of any kind, a fine violin is the epitome of this. It's got to be the most difficult thing to make. And they're making it with such precision. They'll typically draw a kind of grid over the lid when they're doing this and use a micrometer to carve it down to a fraction of a millimeter of, very, very precise measurements that you'd never see in any other kind of woodwork. It's quite astonishing. And
I like very much that you just mentioned the craft, because if, let's say, a layperson would see a violin, would say, okay, it looks nice, it's old, which you just talked about the furnish and you hear it, but the craft is not only on the outside. The craft actually is to make it perfect so that it sounds perfect. So meaning you inside is maybe more secret than maybe on the outside. And I love it. That's exactly that point where you, excuse me, just stick in a lens.
Stick in a probe and have a look around and expose all the secrets. Yeah. Well, I've had this. I mean, I remember talking to a couple of guitar makers and saying, look, I want to do these photographs of the inside of your guitars. And they're a little bit hesitant sometimes because some of them have their own kind of secret techniques. They're using sort of crossbars and so on in certain ways that others might not be, and they're not too happy for that to be sort of exposed to the world. Eventually they usually come around when they sort of see the artistic merit of it. But it is something that, if they've made any mistakes, if they've covered up anything, we're going to see it. Because as you said, these spaces, once they're photographed, they look like rooms. They look enormous, and there's an optical illusion that's going on there. Yeah. And that's a sort of a conscious decision of mine to try and make these things look vast. Like I want you to feel like you can walk around the inside of this cello as if it's sort of been turned inside out and become its own concert hall. And what's happening there is that, we're conditioned to see certain images and think certain things. So if you see an image of say, a bug or an insect, with the typical lenses that are used for these, we call them macro lenses, the insect might be in focus, but then everything in the background is going to be blurry. There's also a thing called focal compression that's going on there, which means that things that are further away from the insect, in real life, if something's further away, it appears smaller. But if you're using a kind of zoom lens and zooming in on something, things that are further away appear a kind of similar size to things at the front. And those two things, that blurriness and that size, that makes your brain realize, even if it's printed enormously, that your brain goes, oh yeah, this is a small thing in a small space, and it knows that this is a small environment. What I've done with these instruments is I try to get everything in focus, from, stuff that's almost touching the lens right at the front, all the way back to as far as we can possibly look down the instrument, or even looking out of it to something else. And when everything's in focus like that, your brain goes, oh, well, look, it's all clear and sharp. It can't be small. It must be big. And, it's sort of doing somersaults trying to figure out what the scale of this thing is. And the first impression people always have is, oh, look, it's an old ship, or it's a,
right.
something like this.
And maybe, Charles, we have to tell, because or that's my assumption. You don't just stick in the lens and make a snapshot. It's hard work. And how many pictures are you doing of the inside just to get at the very end one high resolution picture?
So typically it's around 1,000 shots,
right?
Which is,
so let's breathe in. 1,000 shots, and every shot has a different focus just to get everything sharp, and then you Photoshop it, or I don't know, somehow you get it together.
There's a special software called Helicon Focus, and it's developed in Ukraine. And the people there are still developing it and working. They've moved cities because of the shelling, but they're doing great. So any aspiring photographers out there, anyone who wants to play with this, I strongly recommend going and downloading a demo and maybe buying it if they enjoy it. It's a small way to support people over there. Just keep them working.
The link in the show notes where we do later.
Absolutely, yeah. It's an incredible piece of software. It can analyze an image and determine whether something is in or out of focus. And so it will run through all of my 1,000 images and just extract the bits that are clear and sharp, and then merge it with all the clear and sharp bits from all the other photos. I am pushing it to its limits. It doesn't normally want to use that many photos of that size. But, with enough sort of computing power, it works. And, the reason I have to do this is that, these are very small, very dark spaces. And one of the trade-offs when they made these sort of probe lenses is that, by making it long and thin like that, it also means that it can't let in a lot of light, because that front element is so small. So I have to use it with what we call the widest aperture. And what that really means is that for any one shot, I'm getting maybe 1 or 2 millimeters in focus, and then everything else is a blur, and that's it. Wow. So I have to sit there.
Hang on, how big is a cello?
Yeah, it's, I'm not actually sure. I've never measured it, but it's a lot of millimeters.
Yes, I assume.
Yeah. I take a shot, move the focus very, very slightly, take another shot, move it slightly. Then I have to pause because the cello is getting too warm and I have to turn the lights off. Come back a couple of minutes later, take another shot, and repeat the whole process again. And, sometimes that can take an entire day. Certain instruments are easier than others, but, I enjoy the process. To me, it's very similar to when I was practicing the cello. I think one of the wonderful things about being a musician, when I grew up and learning, is that you get very comfortable working by yourself for extremely long periods of time. I know that if I sit there and do this sort of iteration after iteration and shot after shot after shot, at the end, I'm going to have something worthwhile. And that's the same for me as if I'm practicing a scale or a passage from, a Strauss opera or something. I know that with enough clean, clear work that eventually I'm going to overcome whatever issue I'm going to have in this. And that kind of patience, that sort of long-term patience and that ability to concentrate for an extended period of time is something that I value very, very deeply from my training as a musician.
Yeah. I think in the pre-talk we also, I mentioned Richard Sennett and his book, The Craftsman. And funny enough, he's also a cellist. So, and he talks about that rehearsal, that playing these scales, and it's nothing boring. It's something you have to do. And at the very end, it's not like, okay, got it, I've been there. No, you come to a place where you see new possibilities instead of just checking it off and saying, okay, this was it.
Yeah, I hated scales when I was a kid, and I never wanted to practice them. They were in the exams, and I thought, why am I doing this? I can get just as good by playing the piece just by itself. Why do I have to do all these exercises? And it wasn't until much later in my career that I really started to appreciate what they could do. I'd had issues with intonation for a lot of my life, and I'd have people telling me you're out of tune, and it's fine for someone to tell you that, but if you can't hear it, you can't fix it. And so I started playing scales alongside drones.
Drone meaning one steady sound.
Yeah, meaning a steady sound. And I'd try and find a drone that had not just a clean kind of sine wave sound, but something with a little bit crunchy with a lot of overtones. I found that a lot easier to actually tell if I was in tune against it. And you start to hear some really kind of wonderful things. If you play the same note as one of these drones, if you move ever so slightly out of tune with it, you can hear a kind of beat going on, where it's sort of going in and out of phase.
It's like binaural beats, I think.
Yeah, I forget the proper term for it, but once you're kind of tuned into that, it's exciting to listen for. Like, it's 100% yes, this is correct, or no, it's not. And that was a bit of a revelation to be able to say, yes, I'm right. I'm perfectly in tune. And that became quite a sort of meditative task. I could spend a long time practicing these scales to these drones, and it felt, I guess, a little similar to sort of stretching does when you're exercising. It felt sort of liberating, and I became a little bit addicted to doing that. And of course, as soon as I'd been doing that for a couple of years, everything started taking off. I was winning more auditions. I was getting better positions, and it was sort of making that connection between, the technical exercises and getting them to really help what you're playing, but also just really understanding what the technical exercises are doing and being able to sort of self-analyze them in a way that you knew was right or wrong. It was that level of understanding that I'd been missing at the beginning that changed everything. And that leads into my photography. So everything I do with photography tends to be very, very slow. So if I'm not photographing the inside of these instruments, my other big passion is astrophotography, photographing the stars at night. And that's a similar thing. You can spend hours, days, nights even, trying to get a single shot through, lots of repetition. And I think what I'm really doing there is just another variation on playing the cello.
I like this analogy between playing a musical instrument, in that case the cello, and also photography. And you know the quote from Robert Frank that the eye should learn to listen before it looks. And I love that quote very much. And I think you're the best example of this. So just coming up with special photography because you're just a good listener. And would this be a takeaway for people listening now to us that are on the intersection of making music or maybe also doing some other art and photography?
I think so. I mean, I would not have been able to do this kind of photography without my musical career. Not just because obviously, I've got access to instruments and knowledge of instruments and so on, but it's the training that I had as a musician is critical to how I work with my art now. So I think anybody that's on the fence of changing from a music career into something else, which is absolutely terrifying, I've got to say, and a very, very scary thing to do. When you're so invested in something, you've spent countless hours doing this one thing, to jump ship and change career is, for many people, it's just too much, and they can't do it, and they may be stuck in a job somewhere that they don't particularly enjoy. Maybe the group's, not fulfilling them in the way they would want. But I think you need to realize that as a musician, you are equipped with some really quite outstanding skills that so many people don't have. You're able to get in front of these vast audiences, maintain, a level of calmness, or even, work through whatever fare you have, and you're able to perform at this sort of Olympic level, which, anybody that is a professional sort of salaried musician, I equate them to Olympic athletes. I think it's just as hard, maybe more difficult, to get a full-time job in a symphony orchestra than it is to represent your country in a sport. The numbers of orchestral positions are so tiny that it really does equate. So I think it's important to sort of realize your own self-worth in that case, and the skills that you've got, and that they can apply to all kinds of other things.
Right. And I think it's also some kind of skills on one side, but it's also some kind of pattern recognition, the pattern how you rehearse, and the pattern how you explore or prototype, the way how, in this case, you photograph the inside of an instrument. Plus, I would like to push a little bit further, because you did your research went even further, and I'm still looking at the cello inside. And you also used AI, artificial intelligence, to do something with the room. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes. So AI is something new that I'm excited about. I'm always interested in new technologies and what's around. And obviously this is not just exploring the latest lenses with the camera, but the latest software that I can use. And, I started seeing all these images with AI, and the connection was immediate. I thought, well, these images look like rooms. What if someone were to actually build a room that looked like one of these photos, or looked like one of these instruments? And so I sort of delved into a piece of software called Midjourney. Yeah. And Midjourney lets you put in a text prompt and sometimes a reference image as well. And I was able to say, okay, take a look at this photo of the cello and tell me what some, extraordinary architect like Zaha Hadid would do were they to design a room based around this cello. And what it kind of spits out is quite extraordinary. I don't know what Zaha Hadid would think, but to me, it was an absolutely, fascinating space.
Yeah. So, and it was literally Zaha Hadid. It was literally Zaha Hadid. Yeah, right.
It really feels like it.
Yeah.
I think the future of this is fascinating. There's a lot of people that are worried that it's going to destroy artistic careers and so on. Because, you know, there's even AI that's been programmed to write music now.
Yeah.
And some of the stuff it does is pretty good. But I think, you know, it still needs the inputs. It still needs someone to tell it what to do. It still needs someone to tell it what's good, what's bad, a critical ear. And you can be the master of that. And that's not too different to, say, being a conductor when you're not directly, you know, controlling the instrument. Instead, you're prompting it, you're guiding it, you're nudging it in different directions. But you're also letting it do its own thing. You know, that wonderful control that conductors can have over an orchestra is well, depending on the conductor, of course, is very similar to what I think, you know, an artist can have over AI. And, you know, when these things come together very well, then you create something extraordinary.
I like that analogy because we're talking about prompting and not just conducting. And if you use AI, you're using a prompt, meaning in your case, you just mentioned Zaha Hadid. And I don't know if every listener knows who Zaha Hadid is, but she was an architect that first had an idea. And the building that that it was realized in real life. Do you know what it is?
I don't know. No.
It's the fire brigade building in Weil am Rhein. It's on the German Swiss border, and it's an incredible room. So if you ever be there, let's say near Zurich or Freiburg, Germany, or Zurich, Switzerland, it's absolutely you can have a look at it. Meaning, you as the prompter have to know what Zaha Hadid stands for. And if you would say, do it in like, I don't know, someone else, then it would be different. And to push the analogy to conducting, you must have a vision, an idea of something to prompt so that you can use it. So I like that analogy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can't come from a blank space. You know, you've got to have an idea. And, you know, I find this interesting with classical music, especially. We are sort of, we're playing pieces that have been played a lot. You know, how do you find something new to say with Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, with its 200 recordings that have been done by some of the greatest artists, greatest conductors in the world? Yet, if it's scheduled, you have to, you know, find something interesting, something new to say with this. You have to explore every possible corner of it. And these things are so vast and so complex that there's always going to be something there. And this was the same thing with my photography. I'm looking at these instruments. You know, there's a lot of photographs of violins in the world, a lot of photographs of violinists. And so I'm looking at this going, you know, what can I add to this? What can I do that either hasn't been done, or maybe it has been done, but I can do it in that way a little bit better. And, you know, I'm constantly sort of striving towards that.
Right. I'm just thinking, if you take Beethoven's Fifth, what you just said. So I'm sometimes I would like to, because every music is good. So classical is not better than jazz, or jazz is not better than pop, or pop not better than folk or indigenous music. But how can you convey that special thing that you would say you have to go to that performance of Beethoven's Fifth, and because this conductor is doing something so differently? What is it? So how can we explain people to, let's go to the orchestra, go to a symphony, go to a concert, and dive into?
Look, if I knew the answer to that, I'd be employed as a marketer for every major symphony in the world, and I'd be, you know, I'd be rich. That's a very, very tricky thing to do. You know, I think that, you know, once you're at any kind of national orchestra level, these groups are outstanding. The New Zealand Symphony, the LA Philharmonic, all of these groups have something important to say, something beautiful to present. Every soloist that comes through, their personality is going to mix with this music. It's like seeing a play with different people. They're always going to be just slight differences just because of who they are, and that is what's going to make the music special. So whatever you go to, it's going to be different to your recording. There's going to be bits that especially if you've listened to this piece before, you're going to go, I've never heard that. I've never heard this. And that should keep it exciting every time. Now, convincing people to go to it, that's a thing that orchestras are struggling with worldwide, to be honest. There is a decline in audience. My own sort of small contribution to this is that, if I'm photographing a musician, I want them to look as if, to sort of represent some of that music. So if they're playing a concerto that's particularly energetic and ferocious or something, we might have it so that their violin is on fire while they're playing, which we don't actually set any violins on fire. I should mention, I do that all with vapor and LED lights and practical effects, but nothing dangerous to the instrument. Although there is one viola that a friend of mine plays now that sort of permanently smells slightly of cherry after blowing after blowing smoke through it. So yeah, for me, I've realized that a lot of people's first engagement with a concert is completely visual. There's no people have the sound turned off by default on Facebook or Instagram or whatever. And if it's not visually arresting, they're going to scroll past and they'll never take the time to look at your concert and see what's going on there. So I think that the visuals have to be incredibly impactful. And that's where I feel that I can help as someone that understands both the music and the photographic side. I can sort of bring those two worlds together, and hopefully, the first thing I'll do when I'm photographing a person is say, if they're an opera singer or something, I'll say, right, what are your favorite roles? What do you sing the most, or what do you wish you could sing the most? And they might mention certain operas. They might be something incredibly dark, like Tosca, or it might be a comedic opera, and I will try to draw inspiration from that to inject some sort of personality into the shoot, and hopefully engage much more rapidly with the viewer, who can then become a listener.
Yeah, that's a little bit like the quote we just talked about. So you first have to listen before you look, or in this case, you might shoot.
And also when I was playing, from as early as I can remember, when I was getting into a piece, I would be creating these very detailed sort of visual scenes in my head about what was going on. And, there would usually be some kind of story, almost programmatic, with characters and everything that are going on some kind of journey, and that would help me express the music. And I just did that naturally. And now I realize, hey, maybe I can actually turn some of this into photographic work and sort of spin it around. So that's another project that I've got sort of going on in the background as well. But I think a lot of musicians are creating visual images from pieces that might otherwise seem sort of abstract. And at the same time, of course, you've got an awful lot of wonderful pieces of music that are based on, visual things. If you think of like Rachmaninoff's Isle of the Dead, based on a very famous painting by an artist whose name escapes me right now, but or the pieces by sort of Ravel that are based on fountains, and obviously Mussorgsky's pictures is an exhibition. So this visual thing is there, and I think it possibly could be exploited and explored more.
you played in different orchestras in different countries. You played in, as far as I know, in Patagonia, in Chinese orchestras, in the City Symphony of Sao Paulo, but you always played, let's say, Western classical music in these different countries and these different cultures. How did this work? Where was the difference? Is there a story that you can share?
Yeah, so look, my career started in China. So I'd finished a degree in Australia. I was desperately looking for work and auditioning anywhere I could, and I sent off a recording, and they said, come to this place called Shenzhen. And I went, yeah, fine, accepted the job, and then had to Google where it was. I had absolutely no idea. Turns out it's an absolutely enormous city that wraps around Hong Kong with some 20 million people, and a truly extraordinary place. I mean, in 1980, it didn't exist. It was a tiny 100,000 person fishing village, and then they gave it special economic zone status, and it's now the largest migration in the history of humanity is to this city.
Oh, to Shenzhen.
To Shenzhen, which is quite astonishing. For a couple of decades, they were finishing a boulevard and a massive skyscraper every day. And yeah, the orchestra there, we played mostly classical music, a few Chinese pieces, but they were always in a sort of Western style. I don't think they were particularly successful as pieces. I don't think that the translation to our instruments worked well. I think they worked better on the instruments that they were intended for, which, I mean, if you've ever heard a really good erhu player or someone playing the bamboo flute, I've never heard an instrument as fast as a bamboo flute. There's absolutely no delay. They don't have keys. It's all with holes, but it still has a reed over the sort of mouthpiece, so it projects. They're incredibly loud instruments. And we got to play with the best of those performers, and that was absolutely thrilling, even if I didn't think that the orchestration was great. In Shenzhen, we were very fortunate that at that time there were two very famous pianists who were sort of competing with each other to see who would become this global superstar. One was Yundi Li, the other was Lang Lang. And we were almost their practice orchestra. These guys were already internationally renowned. But I think they knew that they would never be criticized in front of a home audience. So we got to hear them first, and at their worst, typically, whenever they were playing a new concerto, they'd do it with Shenzhen and then head off to, Chicago or wherever. So it was fascinating watching these guys develop, because occasionally, we'd hear this concerto once, and then, a year later they'd come back and play it again, and it would be completely transformed. And then you'd sit there and go, okay, yeah, now I understand why, Lang Lang is this extraordinary global tour de force. He also happens to be an extremely nice guy. So, I like the fact he is, he brings a lot of personality and character, to the rehearsals, but it was never ego. He's happy to chat to anyone. He's so excited about the music that he's playing. It's completely infectious. And of course, once he starts performing, you just get swept up in it, and it uplifts all the other musicians as well. The only danger is that sometimes, what they're playing can be so beautiful, you almost forget to come in and play yourself, because you want to listen to it. You're just transfixed. But so we were incredibly fortunate to play with these guys. But yes, it was always sort of Western music, and especially at that time in China. So this is around about 2006, 2007. they were embracing everything Western. You'd see these big sort of wine shops opening up and all these kind of luxury items coming in. I then went to an orchestra deep in the center of China. It was the first private orchestra in the country, the Guiyang Symphony. So that's sort of just south of the Sichuan province, if anybody knows where that is. Incredibly spicy, hot food, extraordinarily beautiful area. It's where all the sort of karst mountains, those sort of pillars of rock that just leap out of the ground like the movie Avatar. It's where all of that is located. Tremendously beautiful place. And I was playing there, and that sort of rekindled my love for photography, because I'm just in this astonishing environment. And so my time off, I bought a cheap camera and started going around taking photos, which I hadn't done since I was in high school. And that grew from there until finally the photography sort of eclipsed the cello playing. But what I found interesting there was that the orchestra, we had a good audience, but I was never certain whether they were there to enjoy the music or whether they were there to be seen enjoying the music. And that held true for a few places. I mean, that was the same in Brazil with the operas. We had this extraordinary opera house, absolutely beautiful. It's almost a brick for brick replica of Paris Opera, with the big double staircase at the front and the gilded box seats everywhere. And they're, to be fair, their operas are absolutely world class. I mean, all the singers were from the Met, from Covent Garden. The musicians in that orchestra are absolutely world class. But it would be 36 degrees, and people are turning up in helicopters quite often to come to the concerts. I mean, there are some very wealthy people in Brazil, and they'd be turning up in their mink coats and all their gold necklaces. And I'm thinking, you cannot possibly be comfortable. I'm sweating. There were times where they'd say, okay, you're finally allowed to take off your tuxedo jacket, because otherwise, you're not going to be seeing the music for the sweat running through your eyes. And these people are still wearing their mink coats and their heavy gold chains and whatever. So it was this funny mix of sort of elitism. But then again, there were also a large number of people there that did honestly enjoy the music, because the tickets, especially in Brazil, were very, very cheap. In China, I felt that what we were as an orchestra was more of an expensive business card. So our boss was one of the 5 richest people in the province. And if you're one of the 5 richest people in any Chinese province, you're doing okay. He had mining and property development and all kinds of stuff, retail things going on. And I saw it most clearly once. We had a world conference for the environment that was there, and it was full of sort of ex-heads of state. So Arnold Schwarzenegger was there, Tony Blair was there, a lot of these sort of, ex-prime ministers, ex-presidents. And, the first thing that happened at that conference was the opening show with our orchestra. And that meant that our boss got the first introduction to these guys and got to sit with them and dine with them and meet them, and all the introductions before any of the other 4 richest people in the province got to. So we were definitely a tool in China to be used for sort of economic gain in a very roundabout way. I would never have imagined that an orchestra could be used in such a fashion, but that's what it was. A few years after I left, things took a bit of a turn for that group. The vice president of the orchestra got up and started a speech with, there's nothing to worry about, but, and of course,
Then you're warned.
Yeah, so everybody's immediately worried. And he said, look, the boss has had to go away for medical treatment. He'll be back in a couple of months. and I think he said to go overseas. I wasn't quite sure about the translation from Chinese for that one. But the boss disappeared, his wife disappeared, their daughter disappeared from Singapore, and none of them have been seen for 10 years. And that's it. The state took over the orchestra, fired half of them, reduced the salaries by 50%. And so, yeah, there was definitely something to be worried about. But, you know, that's life in China. In orchestras in China, they can be wonderful. And when Chinese orchestras are playing at their best, they are, you know, they're really competitive. They can be outstanding. But, you know, your contract is meaningless, and it's a sort of fragile existence. It could go any way. In China, we saw that in Brazil as well. Whenever a new conductor would come in, and this Brazilian orchestras are a bit famous for this, they would find reasons to fire a lot of people and bring in people of their own.
It's like a big multinational. When a new CEO comes, some people have to go and new people come in. So there's also an analogy there.
Yeah, and I mean, when you say that, it sounds like, oh yeah, that's fine, that's fair, that's what happens, that's the world of business. But imagine that, you know, your country only has one equivalent business. You know, one multinational. So anybody that gets moved from that group, at the very, very least, they're going to have to move city. They're probably going to have to move country to support their family. And they're moving to another country that also probably only has one or two, you know, sort of viable groups that they can get into and make a living off. And that's terrifying. And I found that conductors would some conductors, not all, but some would sort of hold that over people and use that as a, you know, as a bit of a stick to gain power and control over people. And
so how was the collaboration in between the musicians? Because this sounds like this might have an influence. And by the way, I still keep the analogy with the business world, because it seems the same. So what's the culture? What does it, how does the culture change in circumstances like this?
So yeah, you've immediately got a culture of fear. You know, everyone's terrified of talking to the conductor. This can create massive problems if someone's made a mistake. You know, we noticed this in the opera house. If something hadn't been built by the set designers, or something hadn't been ordered and there was a problem, they would hide that from the conductor until the last possible second, when it's too late for him to maybe, you know, call in acquaintances or friends that might have been able to help. And that can create enormous problems. At the same time, that culture of fear, you know, people practiced. People worked really, really hard because they didn't want to be the target. And, you know, at the same time, this particular conductor, who I won't name, but, you know, he would give out compliments occasionally. And when you got a compliment from this guy, wow, you felt absolutely elated, because, you know, moments before you'd been sort of shaking in your boots. And some of the concerts I did with that group were by far the best I've ever played. And I look back and I go, my gosh, that was an outstanding concert. That was breathtaking. But, you know, I couldn't keep going with that level of pressure. I had to leave, because eventually I just cracked. I mean, I was never the target of the sort of, I don't want to say abuse, but of, you know, I was never in the crosshairs, but so many of my friends were, and quite a few of them lost their jobs, and I just got burnt out. And I think that happened to a lot of people there. So you're going to get spectacular results short term, but you're also going to lose your staff. And for someone to leave an orchestral or salaried orchestral position, that means that things are really tough. I mean, it's not like you can just jump on LinkedIn and you know, someone's going to offer you another position. Yeah. No, you're going to have to absolutely shut down everything in your life for months just to prepare for a single audition somewhere else, fly overseas, spend money on, accommodation, on transport, to play for maybe 2 minutes in front of a black screen to a panel that don't know who you are, competing with a couple hundred other people.
And you don't know who's on the other side.
Yeah, they don't know. Everything's supposed to be anonymous, at least usually in the first rounds of these auditions.
No, I'm just asking, how is it
Yeah.
for you? You just get in, you fly hours, you invest money, time, and then you sit in front of a black screen and you don't see the other side if they raise their eyebrows or smile or anything else.
It's terrifying because, you've spent all these months working on these little excerpts. So what they'll do is they will send you a list of the hardest fragments of all the repertoire ever written for this. And sometimes it's more than an hour of music, and not just like playing an hour-long piece. If I'm playing an hour-long symphony or whatever, there's probably just a handful of bars in there where I have to really concentrate to make sure I don't mess up, where I have to put in those hours of work beforehand to make sure it goes smoothly. What you're doing for the hour of repertoire that they've sent you is just those bits back to back, all of them together. It's incredibly tough. And you typically, you've spent the last couple of months being so self-critical because you're trying your best to analyze problems and fix them, that once you get into the audition, it's very hard to turn that sort of self-criticism off. And that can give you problems, because as soon as you hear one mistake, your brain goes, oh gosh, I hope I don't make another. And then you're distracted and you immediately make another, and it snowballs, and you get into trouble. It takes a lot of sort of deep psychological preparation to be able to sort of peak on that day. And it's a tough thing. It's a very tough thing to do. I mean, I did, I think, 36 auditions in my career. I was a finalist in 10 and I won 5. But I have absolutely no desire to go through that process ever again. It's the toughest thing I've ever done, really.
Have you seen the film Tar?
I haven't yet. I've been meaning to, but I've been away traveling in South America for a few months, and it's on my list. But
I saw it last week.
I'm also wondering whether, often when I see movies based around classical music, it's so personal to me. It's either I spot all the things that are unrealistic and it becomes, well, that's not how it is, or it's too realistic. And you're sort of back in a space you might not want to be in. I remember this with the film Whiplash.
Yeah.
Wonderful film for those who don't know it, about a young drummer going through a school in New York with a very tough jazz teacher. And he's like some of the conductors we've been talking about. He's one of these people that will throw out abuse and very rarely throw out sort of compliments. But yeah, I remember seeing that, and I watched it with some friends, and they went, "Oh yeah, great film, really impactful." But surely it's it's all a bit exaggerated. It's all dramatized for theatre, and I had to turn around and go, actually, no, that's in some of the groups, definitely not everyone, and with some conductors, so definitely not all the time. That's exactly what it was like. With the sole exception, a tiny bit of a spoiler for people, that conductors generally don't throw chairs at people.
Or cymbals.
Or cymbals, yeah, but they may, they have that threat over you potentially losing your career, so that I think is potentially more devastating than a chair. So look, it's a fascinating world, and people might be getting the idea from what I'm saying that this was all this one big traumatic event. Absolutely not. There were highlights. I in these orchestras, I traveled the world, so I've played on the edges of the Taklamakan Desert. We've played in all the major sort of halls and opera houses through Europe. I've played with some of the greatest soloists in the world, and seen all these extraordinary places, worked with some extraordinary people. I mean, I was in a chamber orchestra in sort of the forests of Patagonia for 3 years, met my wife there. So it's taken me extraordinary places. I've done extraordinary things.
What stands out?
I mean, it's hard to say what stands out. Everything was so fascinating. I think, Patagonia became a lifelong love affair. Well, literally, I met my wife there. And playing in these extraordinary, unbelievable places. I mean, we went to play in a town called Tortel, which is deep in the Aysén region of Patagonia. And this town, to get to it, first you have to fly to a place called Coyhaique, which is part of Chile, but you can't drive there because you're getting into the fjords. And there's no roads that can connect this. The only way to drive to it would be to take an enormous detour over the Andes and through Argentina. So you fly to Coyhaique, and then you drive 8 hours on a dirt road south. And this was with an orchestra full of instruments and a rickety bus. And then you have to get out and walk for an hour and a half because there's still no roads that go right into town. And when you're finally there, they call it sort of the Venice of the South. It's all these wooden bridges and tiny wooden houses connecting these dozens and dozens of fjords. It's an absolutely astonishing place. And when we were there, so I think this was 2011, they'd got their first cell phone tower just a year before. There's no landlines going into the area. Before that, every communication was done by radio, and it's sort of always on these open channels. So every house knows everybody else's business. They'd get on the radio and say, look, is Bob down at the bar again? Can someone send him up home? He's late for dinner or something. Extraordinary little town that has developed in its own way and feels so isolated. And for us to go there and perform, and we had a couple of marvelous opera singers with us, so we were playing fragments from Rossini, all these Carmen, all kinds of stuff, and they'd never heard this, possibly never heard this stuff before at all, and certainly never heard it live. And that was a major event for these people, and they absolutely adored it. So in a weird way, that was closer to the experience that I had with the metal band Disturbed, where you've got an audience that's transfixed. And I absolutely adored that kind of concert. And of course, as my photography was developing at this time, and you're surrounded by the fjords and the forests of Patagonia, this is the kind of landscape where you could sort of put your camera on automatic and point it backwards over your shoulder, and it would be a National Geographic the next weekend. It's just a absolutely breathtaking place. So that's what sort of really kickstarted my photography career there. I started doing an awful lot of landscape work, which was absolutely thrilling. But then after 3 years in that orchestra, I thought, this is a wonderful little group, but it's not quite progressing at the speed that I want it to. I don't feel like I'm playing at the level I want to. So I started auditioning again. I won the job in Sao Paulo, which was, I was very lucky to get. And then I went to Sao Paulo and I couldn't take my camera outside, because if your phone rings in Sao Paulo City, you don't answer it on the street ever. You go into a shop, you go into a cafe or something and answer it there, or call the person back. Because if you have it against your ear in the street, someone will grab it and it's gone. And actually that's what I experienced that, or I saw that happen to someone else outside the opera house while they were waiting, to go to a performance on the very first night that I arrived. So this lady had her family sitting on the steps of the opera house, this beautiful building. There was a queue of a lot of people waiting to go into the opera. It seemed all right. puts her family on the stairs, holds up her phone. The police are about 3 or 4 meters away, just looking around, and this guy comes past on a bike, and the phone's gone before you can blink an eye. He turned the corner, and the back of the opera house is a place where the police won't go, because there are, in Brazil, you have what we call favelas, which are sort of slums, I guess. But the unusual thing with Sao Paulo is you've got them in the center of the city, in the middle of town. So you've got these massive skyscrapers that maybe they were incomplete, or maybe they were sort of municipal buildings with a couple of guards on the weekend and no one in there. And every so often, 3,000 people will turn up and just say, well, this is ours now. We're living here. And sometimes the guards that are there will say, well, look, I'll keep working here. Do you guys want to pay me instead? And they come to an agreement. And most of these people are very nice. They just can't afford to live in the middle of town and pay normal rents. They're retail. They're working in shops. They're working in all kinds of things. But because of the nature of these buildings, they also attract sort of drug runners and this kind of thing, who will set up office in the center of the buildings, where if the police were to try and go in, it's a battle floor by floor by floor, and they can't possibly get there. So there were about 8 or 10 of those surrounding the opera house in Brazil in a horseshoe. So I couldn't take my camera outside. I couldn't do the sort of low light photography, landscape photography that I loved. So I started turning my lens towards the musicians that were around me, started portraiture. They started paying me for it, and I thought, this is quite nice. Also, I enjoyed the fact that when I've taken a photo, it doesn't disappear. It doesn't vanish in the space of an echo.
Like music does.
Yeah, it's something permanent, and I can show people again and again, and I don't have to practice it again before I show it to them.
Right.
And I find that very liberating. I like the fact that what I'm doing now is creating a body of work that's going to be around, hopefully long after I am, and people can still see it. I regret not recording more when I was performing. That's something I wish I'd done, but there is something rather nice about putting all that work in and having something permanent and tangible. That's
nice.
A refreshing change for me.
And nice that you mentioned this. That's also sometimes we say maybe photography is more the product and playing music is more a service. So you have to do the service all the time, and the product you can sell, or maybe do an update, or maybe bring in artificial intelligence, or what else?
Yeah, I mean, because that's the thing, the number of concerts that I gave, and I thought, hey, that was wonderful. What an experience that was. That was so thrilling. That was so exciting. The audience that were there, they'd agree. But, I can't tell my mum about it and say, well, I can, but she can't experience it. That moment is gone, unless it's perhaps been recorded. And unless it's been recorded well, then they may not get that same sense of excitement out of it that you do when it's live. But it's just a difference in the kind of careers, and something that I'm enjoying that change.
Yeah. So wow, we covered a lot between making music, doing photography, a lot of stories, also traveling different countries. Maybe a last question, and it sounds like the first one. I was just triggered how you described the way how you went to Tortel in Patagonia, and I wonder, how did you listen on that place? Because you were bringing music to these people that they never have heard. There were an intense feeling, like you just described, the playing with the metal band later. What kind of music or what kind of sounds had an impact on you on all your journeys?
I mean, I've talked briefly about the experiences in China with the sort of indigenous musicians there. There was one that really stood out, that sends shivers up my spine every time I think about it. And I wish I knew her name. I don't, unfortunately, but she was a Mongolian singer. So people might be familiar with sort of Mongolian throat singing, which is what the men do, where they sing in multiphonics. So that means you've got two notes sounding at once from one voice box, which is unreal. Very, very unusual noise. But the female singers from there have their own way of producing sound that is a very nasal kind of sound, but it's unbelievably loud. It's astonishingly loud. And I think that this was used as a method of communication. You know, they would be singing to tell people where they were, and you've got to be able to hear that across the plains kilometers away. And so, you know, this was, I've sung with some very, very great opera singers. Sorry, I've played with some very great opera singers, who can cut through an orchestra and, you know, but nothing like this. She could drown out the entire sort of 120-piece symphony with absolutely what looked like no effort, although I'm sure that there's a hell of a lot of training and practice in behind there. And something about the actual music that she was singing as well, which was a little bit sort of pentatonic. So it's this, you know, if you only play music with the black keys on a piano, you're getting a sound that's similar to this. It's a different scale system that to Western classical music. And yeah, it was absolutely haunting, absolutely extraordinary. So, you know, that stays with me. And I think it sort of maybe even woke up a little bit in me. You know, I've got to respect these other kinds of music, these ancient kinds of music, understand that they're not simpler than what I do. They are just as tough. They are just as complicated. They're completely different. And I'm certain that I don't completely understand what's going on there. And I may not appreciate all of it. But that comes into sort of how we were playing when I was in Tortel, especially. You know, I felt that when we were there, we needed to give a stronger performance than anywhere else. Because you wanted to kind of really push the emotions in this piece, because you wanted to make sure that these people weren't sort of ambiguous about it and go, oh, maybe is that supposed to be tragic, happy? I'm not sure. You wanted that to be crystal clear. So I found that actually sort of enhanced how we played, because we were thinking that, you know, this is an audience that you know, they weren't listening to this before, so we need to make it really, really good so that it becomes really obvious. You know, I think maybe in the photography side of things, that sort of comes through as well. When I'm taking portraits, especially, I want there to be some kind of emotion and impact in there, so that people, you know, you get a lot of people saying, people that don't listen to classical music, and this is a well-known sort of saying, where they come up and go, oh, I love classical music, it's so relaxing. And, you know, I think
you should hear Sacre du Printemps or their...
Yeah. I think of all the repertoire I know of 1,000 years of Western classical music, and I can think of about 3 pieces that I would actually qualify as relaxing. Maybe some Satie, I'm not sure. But everything else is so much more complex and so much more interesting than that. And so it's a mission of mine, both as a photographer and as a musician, and bridging the world between the two, to show people that, hey, this isn't relaxing. This is a thrilling, tragic, exciting, happy, sad, every possible emotion you could ever imagine, and hopefully some that you've never experienced before, something new. And that's what we should be putting out there.
Thank you very much. I think that puts it all together. The music
and the photography and also the craftsmanship. Thank you very much, Charles, for sharing.
It's my absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate this because listening is one of the top leadership skills, and I feel honored about this. It is my mission to find, create, and share inspirations for meaningful collaboration based on music analogies. If you want to support this, please subscribe to the podcast, give us a rating, or write a review on iTunes or Spotify. And more inspirations can be found on musicthinking.com. We have a blog, and you can download the Music Thinking Framework. And finally, I would love to hear your feedback. And if you need help with a business challenge, please reach out to me via email podcast@musicthinking.com.